ironic, I'll do that last. So I'm going to start off with a story called The Pendulum. No, I'll start off with a story called The Dead Bell. Hey, Paula. So this is a spooky story called The Dead Bell. Hi, Rob. The night had settled thick and unforgiving over Western Coiney village. The air felt charged, as if something ancient and malignant were crouched unseen within the folds of the mist drifting up from the nearby marsh. Sallow light bled from the occasional window, leaving most of the village shrouded in black. It was here that Ben found himself trudging down the muddy lane towards the old Roxton Chapel, his thoughts shadowed by a heavy sense of foreboding. Ben's hands were damp despite the cold. His fingers clamped around a peculiar ancient bell he'd found unearthed from the attic of his recently inherited home. The thing looked ancient, with a tarnished bronze surface that seemed almost to pulse under his touch, as though it retained some lingering hostile memory. They called it a dead bell, a death omen, supposedly a bell rung to call spirits to the living world. And tonight, on Halloween, it felt hot in his palm, as if it wanted to be rung. He didn't believe any of this rubbish, of course, but Ben's family had whispered about the Roxton dead bell for generations, always in hushed tones, as if speaking too loud might somehow waken the spectres that supposedly haunted it. Tales of vanished children, of ghostly apparitions glimpsed in the mist, all of them linked to that damned bell. His grandfather had claimed it had been buried for a reason, to keep whatever lingered attached to it locked away. But then he'd found it. Something about it gnawed at him, dared him to prove his bravery. He reached the chapel, its spire crooked against the moon, casting a jagged shadow on the ground. The heavy wooden door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the cold, dusty interior, where shadows curled around forgotten pews. The place smelled of rotten damp, and the air seemed thicker inside, pressing down as though the weight of all those who'd prayed here had left an imprint. Ben's fingers brushed the dead bell, and he felt a rush of cold travel up his arm. A reckless part of him wanted to give it a ring, just to see. The idea slithered into his mind, relentless. He raised the bell and shook it. The sound was soft at first, a high thin chime that seemed to shiver through the air, rippling outwards, but then it grew, swelling to fill the chapel, the sound bending and twisting into something that felt alive and wrong. Suddenly the room fell silent. Even the usual creaks of the ancient building stilled, and then came a faint noise, a dragging, a shuffling sound from somewhere in the chapel, as if someone were clawing their way towards him across the dusty floor. Ben felt a chill seep into his bones, but he stayed rooted to the spot, unable to tear his gaze away from the darkness beyond the pulpit. Then he saw it, a faint, ghastly glow flickering at the far end of the room. Something moved within that light, an outline that seemed human, but was bent at unnatural angles, as if twisted and broken. The figure shifted, dragging itself closer, its face coming into focus. Pale and eyeless, with a mouth hanging slack in a wordless scream. It was a child, small and emaciated, its arms reaching out as if in supplication. The dead bell seemed to burn in his hand, urging him to ring it again, louder. Ben's breath came in shallow gasps, terror tightening his throat. "No," he whispered, his voice barely a tremor, but his fingers betrayed him and he rang the bell again. The child's head snapped up, those hollow sockets fixing on him. The expression changed, shifting to one of cold, ancient rage. It began to crawl faster now, dragging itself with unnatural speed, its face twisting into something ghastly and inhuman. Others followed, shadowy figures pulling themselves out of the mist, their hollow eyes brimming with the same unnatural hunger. Panicked, Ben turned and ran, the bell clanging wildly in his hand. As he bolted out of the chapel, the night air bit at his skin. As he stumbled down the lane, no matter how fast he ran, the ghostly figures followed, their dreadful eyes locked onto him, drawn by the sound of the bell. He reached his house, slamming the door shut behind him, his chest heaving. The mist pressed close to the windows, and he could see the shapes gathering outside, watching, waiting. The bell gave one final resounding chime, echoing through the room like a death knell. And then the windows shattered. The figures poured in, shadows thick and silent surrounding him as the dead bell fell from his hand, landing with a dull thud against the wooden floor. It was the last sound he heard before the darkness closed in, swallowing him whole, leaving the bell silent on the floor, waiting patiently for the next victim to pick it up. So that is your first story. The second story features me and Julie. Now then, Julie, I need to pause the live 1 second. I need to pause the live 1 second. Okay, so that's the first story. So, while I've got a few of you in, you may have heard that Diane's Candle Lighters charity that Billy worked so hard for got broken into and some stuff got trashed. I heard about that this morning. Terrible, awful thing. So I figured there's maybe one little tiny way I can help. So what I've done is I'm going to read you 4 stories. That was the first. I've packaged them up into a little download that costs £1. If you download it, I'm going to give every penny to the Candlelighters charity. Share it, see if we can get some sales. I've made 100 downloads available, as many as we can get, Like I say, they're £1 each, a little download, all these 4 stories in one download. Ju is going to pin the link.
Won't let me.
Won't it?
No. It goes on and then goes off.
See if I can pin it. It may be because it's a web link. It doesn't like other media sites. No. Julie will be putting it in the comments periodically. And I'll make it available on our Facebook site. So that's just our little way can help. I know we're doing the charity live next week, but I thought that's one way I could help. I've packaged these 4 stories up into a little booklet. There's a little cover and everything, and it's just like a little tiny little short story. There you go. Juice put the link there. So by all means share it. Okay, Rowena, no problem. So story number 2, which features me Julie and me. Sorry, I couldn't get Facebook to get anyone in, so that we're on here. So next story is called The Pendulum, and it features me and Julie. I know, I can't believe it, Joe. It is awful. But every negative action has a positive reaction, and this is just our little action. Like I say, every penny that's downloaded, I think they take a percentage, but I think it's 82p out of the pound. Every penny out of that, every download I get, I'll send that. I'll make sure that Diane's charity gets it, that the Candlelighters charity get it, one way or the other. I'll do them a bank transfer. So the next story is called The Pendulum. And who do we know that loves a pendulum? It's me Julie. And this features the EY Spirit Seekers. The first story to feature us both. The night was colder than October nights had any right to be, with a damp chill that clung to the skin. Julie pulled her coat tighter, glancing down at the tarnished silver pendulum hanging from her hand. It swung gently in the breeze. Beside her, Daz aimed his torch towards the ancient, ivy-choked house before them. The air felt dense, almost oily, seeping with the kind of wrongness that pressed against their ribs and settled in the spaces between each heartbeat. "Are you sure you want to go in there, Jules?" Daz asked, his voice low but tense, thick with the unspoken memories of the last time they'd encountered something that didn't want to be found. Julie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lowered her eyes to the pendulum, muttered softly, almost to herself, "Show me what we seek." The pendulum stilled for a breath, hanging eerily motionless, then swung hard to the left, pulling her towards the arched doorway. The wood was rotting, swollen with years of disuse, as if the house itself resisted being opened. Julie held her breath as she stepped over the threshold, feeling the air cool by several more degrees. Daz followed her, sweeping his torch around the foyer, illuminating walls covered in discoloured wallpaper, peeling like old skin, a crumbling banister, and the faint scent of mildew tainted with something sharper, like rotting meat. The EY Spirit Seekers had heard about this house, about its murky history. A place where people vanished, where the air seemed to throb with malignancy. Locals claimed it was haunted, cursed by the unspoken sins of a long-dead family. Julie had seen her share of haunted places, but this was different. This house hated. Her pendulum whipped violently as if eager, almost hungry. It led her deeper into the bowels of the house, towards a stairwell that spiraled down into darkness, perhaps oblivion. A faint whimper of wind hissed through the gaps carrying with it a whisper of something old, something that should never have been awoken. As they descended, Daz muttered under his breath, "Feels like it's watching us, doesn't it?" Julie said nothing, her concentration locked on the pendulum, her heart beating faster with each step. She didn't know how far down they'd gone until her feet found level ground again. She raised her torch, sweeping it across a room lined with iron chains dangling from the ceiling, their rusty hooks swaying with a silent rhythm. The pendulum pointed, leading her onwards towards the centre of the room, where a trapdoor lay embedded in the stone floor. Dark stains around it made her stomach clench. Every fibre of her being screamed against opening it, yet her hand reached down, almost compelled by the weight of the unseen. The touch of the cold metal handle made her shudder. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a cavity that seemed impossibly black. As she peered down, she glimpsed something moving, a writhing mass of darkness so thick it appeared almost liquid. Then from within, a shape began to emerge, a figure, skeletal, twisted, with skin stretched across its face, eyes sunken, gleaming like pits of molten tar. Julie stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat, as the thing dragged itself halfway out of the hole, its jagged fingers clawing against the floor, leaving trails of blackened slime in their wake. Daz gasped, his face pale. "Julie, close it! For God's sake, close it!" But she couldn't move. The pendulum swung in her hand, wild, desperate, as though it sought to pull her towards the creature. Her thoughts were clouded, her vision swimming. She realised with a horrid clarity that the pendulum wasn't just a tool tonight, it was a law. Bait for something unspeakable. The figure's head tilted, its blackened teeth clacking together in a rhythm that sounded like some deranged heartbeat. "You brought her to me," it rasped, voice like stone dragged over bone. It extended a hand, and the shadows around it slithered closer, encircling Julie's feet. The cold, so intense, it burned. Her heart thundered as she tried to back away, her own voice trapped in her throat. "Daz!" she managed, finally tearing herself free of the thing's gaze. "Close it! Shut the door!" But Daz was frozen, transfixed, as if bound by the creature's black stare. Julie reached down, pulling the door shut with a brutal force that slammed the darkness back into its prison. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by her laboured breaths. She backed away, her hands trembling as the pendulum lay inert, lifeless against her chest. When she looked up, Daz was staring at her, eyes hollow, face pale as a corpse. "Jules, it spoke to me. Said I was next in the doorway." A horrible understanding dawned. She reached out to him, but his form shimmered, twisting like smoke. Caught in a gale, his eyes, once warm, faded into a glossy black void. She watched in horror as he crumpled to the ground, his body dissolving, scattered into wisps that sank into the cracks in the floor. As it sucked back to whatever dark place the entity had come from, the pendulum began to swing again, unbidden, pulling Julie towards the exit as a voice echoed in her mind. One door closes, another opens. Hope you like that one. Nice, cheerful little tale. So that is story number 2. If you could drop a link, please, me Jules. Available for download, all proceeds going to the Candlelighters charity. Story number 3, and for number 3 we're going to need a prop. And this one is called The Spirit Talker. So my Julie, if you could do the honours, I shall pass you the Spirit Talker. Oops. If you want to set that going, it can go off in the background. It's on full volume. So, story number 3.
Generosity.
The Spirit Talker. It was Halloween night in Wenton, a small village where the air seemed to turn thicker come October, holding its secrets a little closer. The sky was slick, uneasy, black, and lights from the scattered houses dotted the landscape like watchful eyes. Amy walked along the lane, clutching her phone with white-knuckled fingers. She was trying to ignore the knot twisting her insides. But the memory of last Halloween, her brother's haunted expression, and the way he muttered about the voices clung to her like cobwebs. Dylan hadn't been the same since. His room turned into a shadowed cocoon where he barely spoke and hardly left his bed. I'm going to sneeze, I think.
Bless you.
Irish.
Oh, excuse me.
Bless you.
Thank you. Where are we? He'd barely spoke, yada yada. He'd kept insisting it was the Spirit Talker app. Thank you. That it had led something through. It had let something through. Something dark. Amy had brushed it off as imagination. Just another fright that had gotten under his skin. Yet tonight, curiosity and a prickling sense of defiance pushed her to download the app herself, going on to prove to herself that it was nothing but an overblown and elaborate prank. Amy opened the app, the screen casting an eerie glow on her face. A string of static crackled through her earphones and she bit her lip. Just sounds, she told herself. Pressed the button to activate the sweep. The air around her seemed to tense, as though the night itself was holding its breath. She was about halfway down the lane when the app spoke in a voice like cracked glass. Go back. Her pulse stuttered. She rationalised, it's just an app. It's just an app. But this time, those words out there in the cold night, it was different. She felt watched, and her skin prickled as if 1,000 tiny insects were creeping along her arms.
Pain.
It's only randomised words, she said. Random words. Then the voice came again, sharper this time. Help me. A chill crept up her spine as she glanced around, hoping she was still alone on the deserted road. Wenton wasn't known for hauntings, just a quiet sort of eeriness. But tonight, the shadows seemed thicker, pooling at the edges of her vision, swaying like they had a pulse of their own. Stop it, she told herself. It's a trick. But before she could close the app, another voice rasped through the speakers, low and scratchy, as if it had come up from a cavern beneath the earth. Jessica. And then, you can't help me. Amy's heart pounded. The words, can't help, hung in the air like a taunt, and then she felt it, a shifting in the shadows, like something was watching her, tracking her every breath. She turned, almost laughing at her own fear, but her voice caught in her throat. Just there, across the road, stood a figure. No eyes, no discernible face, just an outline of darkness that seemed to drink in the light. It tilted its head in a way that felt strangely familiar.
Frequent.
Dylan? She whispered, barely able to make out the shape. But the figure didn't respond, didn't move. The spirit talker app crackled again. Frequent, it said. And then another voice thick with malice. Turn back. She stumbled, the gravel skidding underfoot, but forced herself to look at her phone. The screen glitched, bright and buzzing, almost as if it was trying to warn her. She took a shaky breath, fingers hovering over the exit button. But another voice spilled through, different this time, quieter and unmistakably familiar. Amy, it's me. It was Dylan's voice, weak like a breath taken from the edge of sleep. Don't. Trust. Mimic. The voice dissolved into static. The screen dimmed. Her heart clenched. Dylan was in his room, wasn't he? She told herself he was. Yet the voice echoed in her ears, clearer than any message from beyond should ever be. Summoning her courage, she managed to squeak out a hoarse whisper. Dylan, are you here? Silence, and then faint but unmistakable.
Walk right.
Her phone displayed one last word before the app crashed completely. Run. The dark shape across the road took a single step forward, its form bending and stretching, as though the shadows were spilling out from it. Amy didn't wait. She turned and sprinted, her heartbeat a staccato drum against the silence. The house lights in the village seemed further away than ever, blurred with her own panic. As she reached her front door, panting and clutching her chest, she dared to look back down the lane. The shape was gone. The night had fallen silent again. A suffocating blanket of blackness and silence. Once inside, she leaned against the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The Spirit Talker app was gone from her phone.
Incident.
Uninstalled. Vanished as if it had never been there at all. When she rushed to her brother's room, she found it empty. A light, but no sign of Dylan. Just his phone lying on the bed. The Spirit Talker app opened on the screen, a single word, faintly. Help. Amy felt the room throb with silence, her own shadows twisting strangely as she reached out, trembling towards the phone.
Pagan.
But before she could touch it, the screen blinked off, leaving her alone in the room, the house thick with the dark quiet of something waiting, unseen, just beyond the edges of the light. Then
Run.
she heard a scratching noise at the door.
We're hiding. Nanny.
Well, I'm not going to say that was a coincidence, but that word run. And we're hiding. All right, Julie, for this one, going to need the necrophonic. Yeah. One more story, guys. Just one more story. This one's called Necrophonic, and the events in this take place a year earlier. The sky was bruised, a deep purple black, heavy like it had swallowed the sun whole. Dylan took a sharp breath and looked down at his phone, fingers jittering over the cracked screen as he reopened the Necrophonic app. He felt like a fool. This was supposed to be a Halloween dare, not some pilgrimage to the lost and damned. But he couldn't shake the feeling, heavy and insistent, that tonight was different. He'd heard stories about this app, Necrophonic. Supposedly it opened channels to the beyond, let ghosts speak through distorted voices and static. Dylan was a skeptic by nature, but ever since that night, he'd felt a need gnawing at him. The silence of his flat had become unbearable, thick with shadows, and no matter how loud he turned up the TV, he couldn't drown out the feeling that he wasn't alone. Tonight, the app's sinister black-red glow was the only light in the room, casting shadows that twitched with the slightest movement. He swallowed hard, his breath quickening as the app loaded, a thrum of static creeping through his speakers. His girlfriend had dared him to turn it on tonight. She called it a laugh, but something in her voice told him she wanted to hear it too. If there's anything still lurking around, she teased, maybe it'll want to talk to you. She'd laughed, but her eyes hadn't. Dylan's finger over the button to start the app, his nerves fraying as he pressed down. A low hum crackled to life, creeping through his speakers. For a long moment, there was nothing but static, then a voice, distant, garbled, dripping through the room like cold rain. Dylan. His breath snagged in his throat. He glanced around, but the only movement came from the trembling light spilling from his phone. He shook it off. The app was programmed to pick up his name, right? A trick, a ploy, something embedded in the code. But no. Hadn't he read that the app only had vowels programmed? There was no word bank, no word storage. The voice shifted, guttural now. Stay. He laughed, though it sounded hollow, as if the walls had devoured it. What are you? He stuttered. But the voice grew louder, less distant, weaving itself into the hiss of static. And then, as if it had been wrenched from some ancient festering corner, another voice joined, this one softer, keening with a thin, eerie melody that echoed in his bones. It was familiar, haunting. Don't you want to know what happened to her? It whispered, soft and serpentine. His heart skidded to a halt. What did that mean? Who is this? His voice was choked, half-broken, desperate. The app's static grew louder, thick as storm clouds, shivering with echoes of old, croaky voices that seemed to coil around him, suffocating. Then piercing the fog came a girl's voice, thin and wet, like someone caught in the jaws of drowning. Dylan, why did you leave me there? The room froze. Dylan's vision blurred, the walls pressing in on him like the dark. Katie, he whispered, his voice trembling. But it couldn't be her. It had been years. She'd vanished that night in the woods. A missing poster left in her wake, her face blurred with rain on every telegraph pole in town. Yes, the voice said, fragile, broken, no longer a whisper, but a sickening clarity, rising like a scream beneath his skin. You didn't look back, did you? Coward. Dylan closed his eyes. his chest tightening with the weight of the memory. They'd been kids, out to prove something to themselves. He could still feel the bite of October air, the tug of her hand slipping away in the thick darkness. He'd run, God he had run, and left her afraid of something he couldn't see. They'd combed those woods, but they never found her. Not a scrap, not a shoe, nothing. Only his silence remained, wrapped around his guilt like a death shroud. He gripped his phone, the screen hot under his fingers, as if it has a pulse of its own. Katie, I didn't know. I couldn't. He stumbled over his words, his own voice lost in the static. But the voices were closing in now. Her voice among them, broken, accusing. The phone grew darker, swallowing the dim glow of his flat, casting everything in sickly shadow, as he heard her voice whisper once more, "You should have stayed." The lights flickered, a final gasp. Before they plunged into darkness, the phone, trembling in his hand, crackled with one last word, so soft it was almost a lullaby. "Stay." And then the static faded, leaving Dylan alone, swallowed by the darkness that rose around him, pressing close like earth, like an ending that had been waiting for too long. A voice near his ear whispered, "Stay forever." And that concludes the stories. Thank you, my darling.